of debate!
I'm Sam, and today we're going to be talking about disadvantages, how to use them in debate when you're negative, and how to respond when you're affirmative. Well, first we're going to talk about what a disadvantage is, just like how the affirmative has its advantage, or what you might call the harms of the advantage, right? The problem that the affirmative is trying to solve. The negative, of course, is going to be answering that, but they also have to give a reason that the affirmative is a bad idea. The way they do that is disadvantages that have their own structure that's similar but a little bit different from how the affirmative makes their argument for why the plan is a good idea. So we're going to go over that structure today to see how you can use disadvantages when you're debating. So there are three parts of a disadvantage. First is argument about what's happening now. We call that uniqueness. Uniqueness is the idea that the world is doing okay now, but we're in a somewhat fragile state, right? The next part of the disadvantage talks about how the plan affects what's happening now. So that's what we call the link. We link what's happening now to what we don't want to happen, and we show how the plan will cause something that we don't want to happen. The final part of the dissad is the impact, and that's just why would this bad thing be bad. That was a little abstract, so I think it'll help to use an example. We're going to talk about textbooks for our example. We can imagine an affirmative who says that we should increase funding for textbooks, right? We should buy more textbooks for students, right? And they might say that the textbooks we have now are old and outdated, there aren't enough, pages are falling out, and all of this is hurting education for students. So they have a clear reason why increasing funding for textbooks is a good idea. So we can make arguments for why, no, the textbooks we have now are okay, it's not really necessary to do this, right? But we also want to say that it would actually be bad to buy new textbooks. One big reason to do that is that textbooks are really expensive, right? And schools don't have a ton of money. So we can say that this is a bad use of funds, and that would be a disadvantage. So to make that into a disadvantage, right, we want to separate that argument into different parts. We need to prove that first, schools have enough funding now to do what they're trying to do. That's what we call the uniqueness. Right now, school funding is okay. Then we need to prove that textbooks are in fact really expensive. If there was someone magically giving away free textbooks, then there would be no funding problem. And then we need to prove that because schools lose funding for textbooks, something bad is going to happen, something else is going to suffer. And that part is what we call the impact. A good way to think about disadvantages is through this little guy named Dissad Joe. We can think of a disadvantage as this little guy standing on a cliff, and there are big spikes at the bottom. We really don't want him to fall. But the plan pushes him over the cliff. That wouldn't be good, right? That's something we really want to avoid. We have Dissad Joe on the cliff, right? And the fact that he's on the cliff and not dead is uniqueness, which I have this U as a circle to mean uniqueness. The link over here is him being pushed off the cliff. And then the impact is these big spikes, the height of the fall. That means that we really don't want him to fall. So to use our example, we have uniqueness for school funding, right? Schools have enough funding now, but schools are budget constrained, right? We want to say that Dissad Joe is close to the edge of the cliff, right? Which would be that schools are budget constrained, but that he's not falling, right? That they do have enough money. The link is, for our example, is money. The textbooks are really, really expensive, which means that if we force schools to buy a bunch of new textbooks, that would mess up their entire budgeting process. They would have to make cutbacks in other areas. And so the impact is, what are they going to cut back? Maybe they can make up all of their money by cutting the CEO's budget from $500 million to $250 million. Then it might not be that big of a deal, right? So you want to say that, well, no, we don't have that kind of free space to work with, right? If we buy a bunch of textbooks, that means that we're going to have to fire teachers to pay for the textbooks, right? So that means that classes are going to be bigger, students are going to have teachers, right? And so even though they'll have better textbooks, they'll have worse teaching. That means that the plan to buy textbooks is actually worse for education, right? So that's the impact. And so that's the basic idea of what you're arguing when you create a disadvantage. If you're the affirmative, you have a few ways you can respond to it, but when you're affirmative, you're going to want to make different arguments about the uniqueness, the link, and the impact of the debate. So for our example of school textbook funding. For uniqueness, we can say, oh, well, schools have a ton of extra money in the budget, right? They're actually running a surplus, they're putting money into savings, they have money that they don't know what to do with, so let's go ahead and put it all into school funding. That would show that there isn't this dangerous problem. So that would show that there's not a problem of uniqueness because we have plenty of funding. You could also make a link argument. We talked a little bit about this earlier, saying that maybe there's this organization that gives out free books, right? So the school, all they have to do is apply and they'll get all the free books they need. There's no link because the school textbooks now are free. That would mean that, right, there's nothing pushing Desenjo off the cliff. Finally, impact. Again, we also talked about this. Maybe there's not actually going to be this decrease in the number of teachers that the negative says because there are other cuts we can make that are less important. We'll just pay the CEO a little bit less, or we'll make some other cut in an unnecessary funding source, right? So that means that, these spikes aren't here. Actually just like a big mattress down here. And it's a nice fun fall, right? Yeah, so these are the three key parts of the debate: the uniqueness, the link, and the impact. And we can see how that's a useful way for the negative to both show how every part of their argument is true, but it also gives the affirmative a way to identify what are the arguments the negative is making, which argument is the weakest, and which argument should we try to contest to prove that the affirmative is a good idea.